Old Dominion University shooting that occurred earlier today. We'll go to that live.
Hospital. We are saddened by this tragedy in our community. The FBI mourns the loss of life in this abhorrent tragedy and violence. I'd like to acknowledge the students who showed extreme bravery and courage by containing the containing the shooter and stopping further loss of life. The FBI is now the lead investigative agency investigating this as an act of terrorism. The shooter has been identified as Mohammed Baylor Jallow. In 2016, Jallow was arrested and pled guilty for attempting to provide material support to ISIL, now known as ISIS. Jallow was sentenced to prison in October of 2017 and was released from prison in 2024. FBI Norfolk's Joint Terrorism Task Force and our evidence response team responded to the scene, and we will continue to have a physical presence here at the scene as we process the evidence. Additionally, we are conducting other investigative steps into Jallow and the specifics of the shooting. We have dedicated analytical and tactical support. We are aiding in this investigation throughout the entire time. We will continue to work alongside of our partners and those in the community to find answers. The FBI continues to ask for the public's help in providing any information that could lead us in resolving this investigation, and we remind the public that any detail, no matter how small, could be useful. A collection of those small details may help paint a complete picture.
A quiet classroom, future military officers sitting at their desks, notebooks open, a lesson about leadership about to begin. Then the door opened, a man stepped inside and calmly looked around the room. He asked a simple question. "Is this an ROTC class?" Someone answered yes. In the next few seconds, everything changed. Gunfire shattered the silence inside Constant Hall at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Students preparing to serve their country suddenly found themselves in the middle of a real-life battlefield. Panic erupted, chairs scraped the floor, someone screamed, and in the chaos a terrifying truth began to unfold. The man holding the gun was not a stranger to federal investigators. Years earlier, he had been arrested for attempting to support the Islamic State terrorist group. After serving time in prison, he had been released back into society. Now he had returned, armed, determined, and standing inside a classroom filled with future U.S. military officers. Within seconds, bullets tore through the room. One respected Army officer and instructor collapsed. 2 others were struck. But what happened next is something no one expected. Instead of running away, the students in that room did something extraordinary. These were not ordinary college students. They were members of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, young men and women training to lead soldiers one day. And in that moment, their training took over. They rushed the gunman. What followed was a violent struggle that would determine whether this attack would end as a tragedy or become something far worse. When police arrived minutes later, they found a scene that investigators would later describe as both horrifying and heroic. A decorated Army officer was dead, 2 others were wounded, and the gunman was lying lifeless on the floor. But the deeper investigators dug into this case, the more disturbing the story became, because the gunman was not the only person responsible. Authorities soon discovered something shocking. The weapon used in the attack had allegedly been sold to him just days earlier by another man, a man who prosecutors now say illegally sold him the gun, a man whose decision may have helped set this deadly chain of events into motion. What really happened inside that classroom? Who exactly was the attacker? Why was a convicted extremist able to obtain a gun again? And how did a group of student cadets stop what could have become a far deadlier massacre? This case is not just about a shooting. It's about warning signs that were missed, decisions that had consequences, and the bravery of students who refused to run when danger walked into their classroom. Before we uncover the full story behind the Old Dominion University attack, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. On this channel, we break down real criminal cases, investigations, and shocking stories that reveal how events like this unfold and what they teach us about justice, accountability, and survival. The morning of the attack began like any other day at Old Dominion University. Students crossed the campus carrying backpacks and coffee cups. Some rushed to morning lectures. Others walked slowly across the sidewalks lined with early spring trees. The atmosphere felt ordinary, peaceful even. Inside Constant Hall, a classroom was filling up with members of the Reserve Officers Training Corps. These were not just typical college students. Each one of them had chosen a demanding path. ROTC cadets balance college education with military training, discipline, and leadership development. Many of them would eventually become officers in the United States Army. That morning's session was led by a respected instructor. Brandon Shah had spent years serving his country. He had flown combat missions, worked alongside soldiers in dangerous environments, and dedicated much of his life to military service. But now his mission was different. Now he was shaping the next generation of leaders. His students described him as calm, focused, and deeply committed to teaching cadets how to think under pressure. In the military, leadership is not just theory, it is survival. And Shah believed strongly that preparation and discipline could save lives one day. Ironically, none of the cadets sitting in that classroom knew how quickly they would be forced to put those lessons into action. The class had barely settled when the door suddenly opened. At first, no one thought anything of it. University buildings are busy places. People walk in and out of classrooms all the time, but the man standing at the door did not look like a student. Witnesses would later describe him as quiet, expressionless, scanning the room carefully. Then he asked a question. "Is this an ROTC class?" The question sounded strange, but not alarming. One of the cadets answered yes. And in that moment something changed in the man's face. Without warning, he pulled out a handgun. The next few seconds would be described by witnesses as pure chaos. Gunshots exploded through the classroom. Students dove under desks. Chairs toppled over. Some tried to run toward the door, while others froze in shock. At the front of the room, Lieutenant Colonel Shah was struck. 2 other individuals were hit as bullets tore through the classroom. The sound of gunfire echoed through the halls of Constant Hall as panic spread across the building. Students in nearby classrooms heard the shots and immediately began barricading doors or fleeing the building. Within minutes, emergency calls flooded local police dispatch centers, but inside the ROTC classroom, something extraordinary was already happening. The cadets in that room were not ordinary students. They were future officers being trained to respond to crisis. And instead of running away, several of them made a split-second decision that would change the outcome of the entire attack. They rushed the gunman. What followed was a violent struggle. Witnesses say multiple cadets tackled the attacker at once. The gunman tried to resist as students wrestled him to the ground. In the chaos, the weapon was pinned between bodies as the group struggled to gain control. It was not a coordinated military maneuver. It was raw instinct, courage, and survival. Several students later told investigators they knew that if the attacker was not stopped immediately, more people would die. So they acted. By the time campus police officers arrived at the scene, the struggle was already over. The gunman was lying motionless on the floor, and the students who had subdued him were standing nearby, shaken, breathing heavily, and surrounded by the terrifying reality of what had just happened. Officers quickly secured the classroom. Emergency medical teams rushed inside moments later. Lieutenant Colonel Shah was found critically wounded. Despite desperate attempts to save him, he would later be pronounced dead. 2 others had been injured during the shooting. One of them was in critical condition, while another was treated and later released from the hospital. Outside the building, chaos was spreading across the campus. Sirens echoed through the university. Police vehicles, ambulances, and federal agents began arriving in waves. Students evacuated classrooms as authorities locked down the entire area. News of the shooting began spreading almost instantly across social media. But investigators quickly realized something disturbing. The attacker was not just a random criminal. His name was Mohammed Bela Jallow, and federal investigators already knew who he was. Jallow was 36 years old. Years earlier, he had served in the Virginia National Guard, but his life had taken a dark turn after he became involved with extremist ideology. In 2016, federal authorities arrested him for attempting to provide support to the Islamic State terrorist organization. Investigators said he had expressed interest in carrying out violent attacks similar to previous acts of terrorism against U.S. military targets. In 2017, he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to prison. For years, the case faded into the background of federal records. Jallow served his sentence, and eventually he was released in 2024. To many people, his story seemed to have ended there. But investigators now believe the events that led to the Old Dominion University attack began quietly after his release. Authorities would later reveal that the weapon used in the shooting was not legally purchased by Jallow. Instead, prosecutors say it came from an illegal sale. And that discovery led investigators to another man, Kenya Chapman. Chapman, 32 years old, would soon face federal charges. According to prosecutors, the handgun used in the attack had originally been stolen from a vehicle in Newport News nearly a year earlier. Investigators believe Chapman took the weapon and later sold it illegally, without a license, and without background checks and without any legal paperwork. And just days before the shooting at Old Dominion University, prosecutors say Chapman sold that gun directly to Jallow. Authorities are still investigating whether Chapman knew who the buyer really was, but the timeline raised troubling questions. How did a man previously convicted of supporting terrorism manage to obtain a firearm again? Who else may have known about the sale? And was the attack planned long before that morning? As the FBI began piecing together the events leading up to the shooting, they uncovered another disturbing detail. Witnesses inside the classroom reported hearing Jallow shout a phrase before opening fire. Allahu Akbar. The phrase, which translates to God is greater in Arabic, is a common religious expression used by millions of Muslims worldwide. But investigators say the context of the attack, combined with Jallow's previous conviction, raised concerns that the shooting could be linked to extremist ideology. Because of this, the FBI officially began investigating the attack as a potential act of terrorism. But one question continued to haunt investigators. Why target ROTC cadets? The answer may lie in Jallow's earlier statements, years before the attack. During his previous case, authorities said he had expressed admiration for the 2009 Fort Hood shooting, an attack that targeted U.S. soldiers preparing for deployment. That attack killed 13 people. Investigators now believe Jallow may have been attempting to carry out a similar act of violence. But if that was his intention, something went terribly wrong for him, because he had not expected the people inside that classroom to fight back. The cadets who tackled him may have prevented a far deadlier tragedy. And in the hours that followed the shooting, officials across the country began recognizing their bravery. The FBI praised the students for their actions. Military leaders acknowledged that their training and courage likely saved lives. Even the director of the FBI publicly thanked the cadets who stopped the attacker before more victims could be harmed. But behind the praise and recognition, a deeper investigation was unfolding. Federal agents were now examining every step that led to that classroom. They searched Yallow's background again. They analyzed the weapon used in the shooting. They traced the illegal gun sale. And then they began asking a disturbing question. Was this attack an isolated act? Or was it the final step in a plan that had been building quietly for years? In the hours after the shooting, the campus of Old Dominion University felt like a completely different place. The sidewalks that had been filled with students that morning were now lined with police vehicles. Yellow crime scene tape wrapped around the entrance of Constant Hall. Armed officers stood guard outside the building as investigators moved in and out carrying evidence bags. Inside the classroom where the attack had taken place, FBI agents and forensic teams worked carefully through the aftermath. Desks were overturned, backpacks were scattered across the floor. Bullet casings glinted under the harsh light as investigators photographed every inch of the room. But the most important question investigators needed to answer was simple. Why? Why had this man walked into a classroom full of ROTC cadets and opened fire? The answer, they suspected, began years earlier. Federal agents quickly confirmed the identity of the attacker. His name was Mohammed Baylor Jallow. For many investigators, that name immediately sounded familiar, because this was not the first time Jallow had been the subject of a federal terrorism investigation. Years earlier, in 2016, the FBI had arrested him after uncovering disturbing online activity. According to investigators, Jallow had been communicating with individuals connected to extremist networks and had expressed support for the Islamic State group. During the investigation, agents discovered something even more alarming. Jallow had reportedly discussed carrying out an attack similar to the one that occurred at Fort Hood in 2009. That attack remains one of the deadliest acts of terrorism ever carried out on a U.S. military base. A gunman opened fire on soldiers preparing for deployment, killing 13 people and injuring dozens more. According to investigators, Jallow admired the attacker and believed similar violence could be justified. Those statements led to his arrest. In 2017, he pleaded guilty to attempting to provide material support to the Islamic State group. A federal judge sentenced him to prison. For years, the case faded into the background of the justice system. Jallow served his sentence inside a federal facility while investigators monitored his behavior. But like many convicted offenders, he eventually became eligible for release. In 2024, after serving several years behind bars, Jallow was released from prison. For federal authorities, his release was not unusual. Hundreds of inmates leave prison every year after completing their sentences. But cases involving extremism are always watched carefully. Even so, once Jallow was back in society, investigators say there were no immediate signs that he was planning violence again, at least not publicly. What happened in the months leading up to the attack is now a critical part of the investigation. Authorities believe that sometime after his release, Jallow began preparing for something, but he had one major problem. As a convicted felon, he was legally prohibited from owning a firearm, which meant if he wanted a gun, he would need to get one illegally. And that is where another man entered the story, Kenya Chapman. Chapman was 32 years old and living in the area near Norfolk. According to federal prosecutors, the gun used in the shooting had originally been stolen from a parked vehicle in Newport News nearly a year before the attack. Investigators believe Chapman was responsible for stealing that firearm. Instead of turning it over to authorities, prosecutors say he kept it. Then, days before the shooting at Old Dominion University, Chapman allegedly sold the weapon to Jallow. The sale was illegal in several ways. First, Chapman did not have a license to sell firearms. Second, there was no background check. And third, Jallow, as a convicted felon, was not legally allowed to possess a gun at all, but investigators say the transaction happened anyway, and authorities are still working to determine exactly how the two men connected. Did they know each other personally? Was the sale arranged through another contact? Or was it simply an illegal street sale that placed a weapon into the wrong hands? Those questions remain part of the ongoing federal investigation. What investigators do know is that the gun ended up with Jallow, and just days later he walked into a university classroom with it. Meanwhile, forensic teams were analyzing the weapon recovered from the scene. Ballistics experts confirmed it was the firearm used during the attack. They also discovered that only a small number of shots had been fired before the gunman was tackled by the ROTC cadets. That detail reinforced what investigators had already begun to suspect. And the students who rushed the attacker likely prevented far more casualties. Had the gunman been able to continue firing, the outcome inside that classroom could have been much worse. But while investigators examined the weapon and the suspect's background, they were also trying to reconstruct the final moments leading up to the shooting. Witness interviews revealed chilling details. Students said the man entered the room calmly. He did not appear rushed or nervous. He looked around the classroom as if he were confirming something. Then he asked the question that would haunt everyone who heard it. "Is this an ROTC class?" When someone answered yes, he shouted a phrase, "Allahu Akbar." Then he began firing. Because of Jallow's past conviction and the statement reportedly made during the attack, the FBI quickly classified the investigation as a potential act of terrorism. But federal authorities were careful in their public statements. They emphasized that the phrase itself is widely used in religious contexts and does not automatically indicate extremist intent. Instead, investigators were focusing on the broader pattern of behavior: his previous conviction, his interest in attacks against military targets, and the fact that he specifically asked if the classroom was an ROTC class before opening fire. To investigators, that suggested the attack may have been planned with a specific target in mind: military personnel, or people training to become military officers. If that theory proves true, it would mean the shooting was not random. It would mean the classroom had been deliberately chosen. While federal agents continued digging into Jallow's history, the community around Old Dominion University was still trying to process what had happened. A vigil was held on campus. Students, faculty members, and military officials gathered to honor the life of the man who had been killed in the attack, Brandon Shah. To many of the cadets standing at that vigil, he had been more than just an instructor. He had been a mentor, a leader, someone who had dedicated his life to serving the country and teaching others how to do the same. Virginia's governor publicly praised him for his service and sacrifice. Military officials described him as a devoted officer who believed deeply in preparing young leaders for the responsibilities of command. For the cadets who had been inside that classroom, the loss was deeply personal, and they had watched their instructor fall. And then, moments later, they had fought to stop the man responsible. But even as the community mourned, the investigation continued, because behind the tragedy were questions that demanded answers. How had a convicted extremist obtained a gun? Why had he targeted ROTC cadets? And was anyone else involved in helping him prepare for the attack? The answers to those questions could reveal whether this tragedy was the result of one man's actions or something much more dangerous. The investigation into the attack at Old Dominion University did not end when the gunman died on the floor of that classroom. In many ways, that was only the beginning, because for federal investigators, every tragedy like this raises the same haunting question: could it have been prevented? As forensic teams finished processing the crime scene, agents from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force began examining every detail of the attacker's life. They looked at his travel history, they reviewed phone records, they searched digital devices, they examined financial transactions. Every message, every contact, every movement in the weeks leading up to the attack was now under a microscope. The man at the center of the investigation, Mohammed Bela Jallow, had a history that already placed him on the radar of federal authorities. Years earlier, he had admitted in court to attempting to support the Islamic State group. During that earlier case, investigators learned that Jallow had been fascinated by violent attacks against military targets. He had reportedly discussed the possibility of carrying out an assault similar to the infamous shooting at Fort Hood, where a gunman targeted U.S. soldiers preparing for deployment. That attack had killed 13 people. When Jallow pleaded guilty in 2017, he was sentenced to prison, but like many federal cases, the sentence eventually came to an end. In 2024, he was released. For investigators, his release had followed normal legal procedures. Once someone completes their sentence, the law allows them to return to society. But the events that unfolded at Old Dominion University raised difficult questions. What happened after he left prison? Did anyone notice warning signs? Did anyone realize he might still pose a danger? Federal agents now began reconstructing the timeline of Jallow's life after his release, and they learned that he had been living quietly in Virginia. There were no major public incidents that drew attention to him. No violent crimes, no arrests, at least none that had been widely reported. But investigators believed that behind the scenes, something had been building. Because at some point before the attack, Jallow managed to obtain a gun, and as agents traced the firearm used in the shooting, they discovered a troubling chain of events. The weapon had not been purchased legally. Instead, prosecutors say it had been stolen. Nearly a year before the attack, a firearm was taken from a vehicle in Newport News, Virginia. At the time, the theft may have seemed like a minor property crime, but according to federal prosecutors, that stolen gun would later become the weapon used in the Old Dominion University shooting. And investigators say the man responsible for selling that gun was Kenya Chapman. Chapman, 32 years old, soon found himself facing federal charges. Prosecutors allege that he took the stolen firearm and kept it instead of reporting it. Then, days before the attack, Chapman allegedly sold the weapon to Jallow. The sale was illegal. Chapman did not have a license to deal firearms. There was no paperwork, no background check, no record of the transaction. And because Jallow was a convicted felon, he was legally prohibited from owning a gun in the first place. That meant the weapon should never have reached him. But according to investigators, it did. Federal prosecutors later charged Chapman with dealing firearms without a license and making false statements while purchasing a firearm. The authorities say the case is a reminder of how illegal gun sales can have devastating consequences, even when the seller claims they had no idea what the buyer intended to do. As the legal case against Chapman began to unfold, the investigation into the shooting itself continued. Agents wanted to understand exactly what Jallow had planned that morning, and the more they studied the timeline, the more it appeared that the attack had been carefully chosen. When Jallow entered the classroom, witnesses said he immediately asked one specific question. Is this an ROTC class? That detail would become one of the most important clues in the entire case, because it suggested that he was not simply targeting random students, he was looking for a particular group. The Reserve Officers Training Corps, young men and women training to become officers in the United States military. For investigators, that detail raised the possibility that the attack was intended as a symbolic act of violence against military personnel, a theory that aligned with Jallow's earlier fascination with attacks against soldiers. But there was another element of the story that investigators say changed the outcome of that day: the cadets. When the shooting began, the students in that classroom faced a split-second decision: run or fight. and several of them chose to fight. Witnesses described how multiple ROTC members rushed the gunman as he fired his weapon. They tackled him, pinned him to the ground, and struggled to stop him from firing again. When police officers finally entered the room, they found that the attacker had already been subdued. T. Challow was dead. Authorities later confirmed that he was not killed by police gunfire. Instead, he died during the struggle after being tackled and restrained by the cadets. Investigators believe that moment may have prevented a far worse tragedy, because based on the number of people inside the classroom, the gunman could have inflicted far more casualties if he had been able to continue firing. Instead, his attack was stopped within moments. The bravery of those students quickly became a national story. Federal officials publicly praised the cadets. Military leaders acknowledged that their actions likely saved lives, and many people across the country began recognizing the extraordinary courage displayed by young men and women who had not yet even entered active military service. But even as their bravery was honored, the loss of one life weighed heavily on the community. Brandon Shah had spent his career serving the country. Friends and colleagues described him as a dedicated officer, a mentor to his students, and a man deeply committed to preparing future leaders. Virginia's governor honored his service publicly, calling him a man who did not just serve the nation, but inspired others to do the same. For the cadets who had been inside that classroom, the tragedy would never be forgotten. They had walked into class expecting an ordinary training session. Instead, they had experienced a life-or-death struggle that would change them forever. And as investigators continue examining the case, the story leaves behind difficult questions that society must confront. How does someone with a history of extremism manage to obtain a firearm again? See, how do illegal gun sales continue to circulate weapons in communities? And how many tragedies could be prevented if warning signs were recognized earlier? What happened inside that classroom was a horrifying act of violence. But it was also a story of courage, a story of young cadets who refused to stand by while innocent people were in danger, a story of an instructor who dedicated his life to serving others, and a reminder that sometimes the difference between tragedy and catastrophe comes down to the actions of a few brave individuals. Cases like this force us to look closely at the systems meant to protect society and the moments when those systems fail. But they also reveal something powerful about human nature. In the face of danger, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. If this story moved you, well, take a moment to subscribe and join this channel. Here we uncover real criminal cases, investigate the events behind them, and tell the stories that reveal how justice unfolds. And if you believe those ROTC cadets showed incredible courage that day, let me know in the comments, because sometimes the heroes in a true crime story are not investigators or police. Sometimes they are the people who refuse to run when danger appears.